Good evening or good afternoon. My name is Lianrui, and I'm a lecturer at the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield. So it is with great pleasure that I'm going to share with you some of my own experiences and understandings of researching social media as digital platforms. So just thinking about this title, I'm just going to give you, because I think every one of us are coming from a slightly different background and we're interested in different topics. So this presentation is designed to give you a wide range of flavor of what does it mean to study social media as digital platforms, and what are their research objects. So what are we really talking about, or what are we really studying when we're looking at digital platforms? So here is a quick content overview of today's presentation. So firstly, I'm going to briefly talk about the existing field of social media research that has emerged in the mid-2000s. And then we're looking at the rise of platforms, both as a very news-worthy and topical trend, as well as emerging academic discipline or field of studies. Then I'm going to introduce you some of the key principles and research objects of platform study. So what are the key questions we're addressing, and what are some of the methods that we're using? And lastly, I wanted to end up with some of the examples and probably pinpoint you to some of the existing study, including some of mine, using platform study to look at social media or internet companies. And I think since the platform is so popular, every one of us might heard about this concept or read about it in our PhD or MA studies. And today is really to give you a really systematic or probably a more a bit historical look at platform studies. Okay, so let's get started. So first, let's talk about social media research. Social media is the term that we engage with what we call now platforms many times ago. And so when we talk about social media, there are several shared characteristics between them. So first is their sociality, right? So we social media has built in these affordances for different people and between people and institutions to establish these connections, interconnections online, and they sometimes have profiles, right? So there's a really kind of personalized style of internet communications. Another focus on social media is user-generated content. And there's a very common thing that, Facebook does not generate content, the users do. Right? So when we study social media, there is a lot of focus on the content produced by its users. And the other key characteristic of social media is that it is always changing, right? So these companies, they can become very popular over time, but also they can, wane in their popularities and business. They're operating as a business, of course. So also the way that we address this website or this companies changes over time. So previously we engaged with the names such as SNS, social networking sites, and or online social networks. So with each different names, of course, it encapsulates the different historical context and the technical details of this website, but also it reflects what are some of the shared concerns when we address it as our research objectives. And lastly, there's always this element of studying social media as a form of digital technology, right? So of course, this is of interest not only to media scholar, but also, for example, science and technology studies. And when we talk about social media research, when we look at the research agenda yearly, there are two types of questions that we generate based on social media. First is how social media are relating to the people that are or institutions that use them itself, right? So our usage patterns and how the affordances of social media or the functions that are enabled social media also influence our ways of using it, right? So, and of course, sometimes we contest the function that built in the social media, and we as users also reappropriate it. And the next set of questions are how the social media as a tool can inform our understanding of existing social phenomena. Right, so this is adding more substance in the digital sense to understand some of the very long-lasting social phenomena, social issues. Right, and also you can keep this in mind, and later when we talk about platforms, you can really compare and contrast what are some of the different agendas and also similar concerns that shared by platform studies. And more broadly, I include some of the old logos of some of the social media, and you can see that within the last 20 or 30 years, a wave of different social media has come and go, right? And they also have gone intensive economic restructuring. So, for example, WhatsApp has been bought up by Facebook, and so does Instagram as well. Okay, so when we talk about the social media research, two group of questions. So first, social media uses, not only by individual, organization, or sometimes government, appropriate these tools. And also how social media is a tool or method to inform our understanding of social phenomena. And this include a wide range of topics from issue of representation, how does individuals identify and present themselves, or to issue of political action or participation or civil action participation, to users and gratification, right? How does the use of social media fulfill the user's perceived need? Okay, and also we're also looking at some of the positive experience, usage, and activity counts, and the emerging social context. So I see there is a question that popped up in the chat asking its research on how social media use shapes social phenomena. A third category of research, does it sit across the two categories, in my opinion? So yeah, I think this perspective is more aligned with the STS, right? So it pay attention to the social media itself, right? So I took that two categories from one of the existing literature review. Actually, it's a handbook. I think I put the citation somewhere in the slides, but it's based on what people had surveyed from the existing. But absolutely, you're right. I think people also study how social media itself, the technical makeup of those influence social phenomena. Okay, so now let's move on to the rise of digital platforms. And I guess it's somewhat self-evident, right? Because we heard about it and we use it on a daily basis. But let's look at some of the emerging trends. So on the left, you can see that the way that we address these companies, these internet companies as platforms, has becoming an increasingly theorized and popularized academic terms, right? So various authors have write about the rise of the platform society, where platform kind of become an infrastructure-like system that is crucial for the day-to-day operation of the society, or platform capitalism. Some argue that platforms brought a new stage for in the historical changes or transformations of capitalism. And on the right-hand side, you can see there are some of the clips of the news articles. So of course, they are making the news headlines every day. And also in the middle, you will see that this is how some of the investment bankers or people who are deciding where to put their monies for to generate more profit pay attention to as well. So they're definitely entered the economic accumulation realm as well. So politically and socially, digital platform is increasingly gaining some tractions. And what about some data for more of the macro view? So the chart on top is a a chart that I took from Ofcom's Online Nation report. And you can see that, actually a significant amount of time that we spend every day are spent on these digital platforms, right? And the time we engage it varies about the different age groups. But on average, it says how ubiquitous platform has reached to different age groups. And on the chart below it, it shows that the huge user population that gathered by these different platforms. And if they were nations, Facebook's population has already surpassed those of China and India, right? And this in itself is really, really important. And think about, our internet culture and who are on the web and their language and culture that they bring to what is accessible through these platforms as well. So the saying that, on the individual levels, people engage with platforms very intensely on their daily basis. And not last but not least, on the left-hand side, it shows that the incredible amount of wealth that this digital platform has accumulated over, let's say, over 20 or 25 or 30 years, right? And you can see some of their market capitalization, which means how much these companies are valued in the eyes of the market or in the eyes of the shareholders, how much they value compared to other economic sector or the GDP of certain countries or vis-a-vis some other companies, right? And on the right-hand side, you will see that how fast they are changing the stock market as well, right? So in the 1970s, you can see that there are some big telecom firm or energy firms that has ranked the highest in the eyes of capital investors. And in the 90s, we have the dot-com bubble, right? So the hardware manufacturer, IBM, AT&T, which is big telecom operator in the States. Also energy sector can occupy the most valued company in the stock market, right? And moving along to 2010, 2020, now definitely these tech firms are taking over. Right, so this is not only significant in the sense of the sheer numbers, but also where the whole society perceive the next most valued poles of growth are going to be. Right? So there's definitely causing a lot of changes in the stock market as well. And lastly, so this company makes certain individuals very powerful and very wealthy. Right? And I took this chart from the Bloomberg database, and this is how Mark Zuckerberg's personal wealth has worked over just a period of 1 year. Right? So on the left-hand side, the timeline starts in 2020 in November, and now I just captured as of yesterday. Right? So you can see, across the COVID-19 pandemic, and even lasting till today, that Facebook has generated more than 10 billion. And so I also saw it on Twitter yesterday that someone was looking at Elon Musk personal wealth. So he started out around 13 billion in 2020, and now he's at 100 and something billion. Right? So his personal wealth, grow tenfold over 1 year. Right? So it's also saying that how quickly this become the new capitalist or the power centers around this very key individuals in the society. So I think that's give you a good sense of the rise of platform, not only in the economic sense but also socio-economically. So here is a definition of platforms. So of course, different people have different way of defining it or study it. But this is a definition that took up by Thomas Poole, David Nyborg, and Jose Van Dijk. So these are a group of scholars that emerged and still are somewhat located in the Netherlands. So they're also, in the platform study arena, they're called the Amsterdam School. Right, so they define platform as the reprogrammable digital infrastructures that facilitate and shape personalized interactions among end users and complementers. So complementers in this sense means various of third parties, right? So it could be either the developers, advertisers, various institutions or government agencies, and organized through the systematic collections, algorithmic processing, monetization, and circulation of data. And you can find this definition in their 2019 publications in the Internet Policy Review. Okay, so I would say the important part of this definition is the reprogrammability, right? So which means that the technical system or the technical code of the platform can be instantly switched or accommodated to suit the needs and interests of different parties. Right, so Facebook can decide to close up its data access for third-party advertisers, or it could decide to open it up. And of course, their action is decided in part by which stage this platform is developing through. So for example, when Facebook was first emerged, of course, it's more open and welcoming to different people to use and interconnect with their platforms. And they grow, as they grow more powerful, they become more exclusive. Okay, so this is the definitions of platforms. And here I include several examples and to really use the platform way of thinking to reconsider some of the things that we know as media previously. Right, so if you think about newspaper, don't think about the content, but think about it as a medium. It is in fact a platform, right? So on the one hand, if you work for a newspaper, especially a for-profit newspaper or privatized newspaper, on the one hand, you are attracting advertisers, right? And on the other hand, you also need to, manufacture the combination of the flow between, where to put the ads and where to put the news, and to package this products and to fit it or to present this product into your reader, right? So the newspaper essentially is a platform. And this is also the game consoles, right? So in the middle, you can see there are different gadgets. And of course, these are the hardware manufacturer. So either be Sony or Microsoft, Xbox or PS or some of the old Nintendo game console. So in the middle, you sit this gaming companies and hardware manufacturers. And on the left-hand side, you have the market or the supply of game studios, right? So those who write games, come up with games, do the design, the storyline, do game development. So that is one market that supply this value chain. And on the right-hand side, of course, you have the gamers, right? So the average people who are interested and likes to play games. And they have to, play the game through these consoles, right? So the consoles or the hardware become the essential platforms where we can, access or play these games. And on the bottom, you also had advertisers, right? So you can see that this company sit in the middle, kind of as a platform, matching this different supply and demand market. Right. So if you really think about these evolution of different medium or tech gadget, you can still think about some of the original architecture of platforms. Okay, so what is platform studies? So I figured a good way to think about platform study is to look at what it is not. And so there are some misconceptions of platform studies. Because its origin in game studies, right? So if we think about the games, the action of play is, crucially related to the gadget we own, right? So either it's a desktop computer or it's handheld devices, or or the bigger consoles or the TV screens, right? So the games are essentially tied to different hardwares. So therefore, platform studies kind of has one of the roots originated from the game studies, right? But what we conceive as platform studies now is not all about hardware. It's also about software, right? So the code, the algorithm, the interface, and some of the constructions of affordances as well. And also, it's not all about video games, right? So of course, study of games and video games contribute to very significantly to how we conceive these companies as platforms. But now platform study has come to include more than just video games. And not everything is a platform. Right? So as we see in the definition previously, the ability to program is technical kind of architecture is key here, right? And this ability to access data and to reappropriate and further build on these platforms is what makes platforms so powerful compared to previous, social media sites. And so these are, I would say, the crucial differences between the social media sites versus platforms. So whether you can access those data and build on top various functions on top of these platforms. So think about Facebook and the mobile games of Farmville, right? So people can access the data of your own personal network and personal contacts on Facebook, and push you to play that social games based on your personal interconnections. And platform study is also not only about technical details, right? And as we'll see later, it's also about the social, economic, and cultural elements. So if we talk about platform studies, the principal concerns of what we're really looking at is the role that platforms play in mediating our media, communication, and cultural environment. And this pays attention to not only the materialist aspect of platforms. So in this sense, it takes its inspiration from game studies, infrastructure studies. And so there's an emerging line of scholar looking at how platform becoming increasingly the infrastructure such as water or telephone towers or road or electricity grid in our society, right? And also software studies. These are some of the intellectual or academic disciplines that informed platform studies. And also share some of the core concerns of the media and communication disciplines. So after all, some of the predominant platform that we engage on a daily basis still deals with digital communication or social media. And so here we also draw upon the key concepts and terms from sociology, media studies, and cultural studies. So I would say that platform is really interdisciplinary, and depending on your own research interests, you can incorporate platforms and the study of platform in a different way to your own research topics. Okay, and if we look at the formation of platform studies, the last slides talk about some of the key objectives, and here we're further parsing out its three intellectual roots. And so first, there's software studies, business studies, and media and communication studies. And I will go through each one in the following slides. So firstly, software study, of course, has very important contributions to look at platforms, and they are one of the early disciplines to look at this thing called platforms, right? And therefore, they're very attuned to their material dimension of platforms, right? Which is composed by both the hardware and software. So for example, in the example of game console, right? So the console itself is a hardware, and to make the platform work, you also need various aspects of element to work together. right? And also there's the software that built upon and utilized by these devices. And crucially, software studies tend to look at issues such as the application programming interface, in short terms, the API. And these are essentially the gateways for third parties to access platform data, right? So if you are, for example, an advertiser, and you would like to know that how people talk about certain brand on Facebook, and you would want to access some of the data that are made public by Facebook, because essentially some element of Facebook is public facing. So the API, you can design a program and port yourself through API to access some of the data and to analyze, for example, people's emotions when they talk about a certain brand, to know where is this brand going, and how should we adjust our advertising strategies. Another key object of study is a software development kit, also short form SDK. And these are the tools provided by the platforms for developers to build on top of their platforms. So also use that example of the social games that built on Facebook, right? So it's essentially enabled by Facebook itself, right? So it provides some tools for third-party developers to reappropriate some of the functions provided by Facebook as well. And the two examples that I provided here on the left-hand side is a Facebook for developer page. And if you're interested, I strongly encourage you just in your own spare time to check it out. It looks very different. And so I'll also shed you some insights of not as an end users, but also as the complementers, right? So if you want to have a business, and because Facebook or Twitter has already had so many users, right? So you can access them as a base to approach and to push your products and to further build on it. Okay, so essentially, the API and SDKs regulate the data flows, and they also decide what access third parties can have. And these decisions are purely made by the platform itself. Right? So this also is a very critical issue, because the one who has all the powers in setting these relations, and in sometimes this availability of API or SDK matters to other smaller business, because their whole business model or profit model is built on their ability to access this data. And here's another example. So on the top, Twitter has acquired Vine, which is an old video sharing platform or app. Right? So after they two had formed business alliances, Facebook decided to shut their data access for Vine in effort to compete with Twitter. Right? This tells you how randomly or how powerful these platforms are in arbitrating some of these decisions. Right? So and also through API and SDK, these platforms can really take advantage of the third party's creativity or their own product development. And on the bottom is an example of Twitter purchasing TweetDeck, which is originally a third-party developer that can stream the data from Twitter and present it in a way that is as you can see in a different format and easier to operationalize as a Twitter user. Right, so this standalone third-party applications was later bought and purchased by Twitter, and you can see that all these creativities or business, decision or strategies can really be appropriate by platform owner itself to enrich and empower themselves. So going on to the next intellectual roots of platform studies are business studies or economics. So the way that economists engage with platforms is to view them as matchmakers of different markets. right? So as the example of newspaper or game console that I showed earlier, so the newspaper essentially is playing this matchmaker between the advertisers and the end users, right? So think about the scope of a certain newspaper. So for Wall Street Journal, of course, those investors or people who care about global news or global perspective are more likely to become the reader of new Wall Street journals, right? So sometimes when you browse online, you will find they push some of the advertising of expensive luxury mansions to you, right? So because they match their potential and existing readers and their socioeconomic status with the type of ad that they put onto the newspaper page. And similarly, with Facebook, they're essentially matching, the advertisers with their own different group of Facebook users. And essentially, one of the key figures is Jean Tirolo, which is a French economist who won the Nobel Prize in 2014 based on his work studying platforms, right? So this is the structure who are managing or providing or matching to a multi-sided market between buyers and sellers. Okay, so what's important here is that there is an unequal power relationship between different sides of the market. Right? So as a user of these platforms, we don't pay a cent to use, for example, Twitter or Facebook or TikTok, for example, right? So we use it as free, but in other sense, we also provide our data, right? And for advertisers, they charge a very high premium to put their ads onto their platforms, right? So the power to set the price and to decide which side subsidize the other is purely fall in hands of these platform owners, right? There is a popular, saying that Airbnb doesn't own any hotels, Uber doesn't own any cars, Facebook doesn't create any content, and so on and so forth. So these platforms are actually not asset heavy, so they don't own a bunch of stuff, but they're powerful because they are sometimes the gatekeepers to this market. And so this is the business kind of perspective that approach at different platforms. And all these this perspective are not should not be viewed in its own kind of isolation, right? So you can think about how it can inform your understanding or your research about platforms as well. So lastly, there is this discipline of media and communication studies. So of course, people are engaged from the perspective of ICTs, right? So it's form of digital technology. And also within media and communication study, there is political economy, right? So political economy basically concerns about how power is operationalized or allocated, or how resources allocated by powerful institutions or significant political interests or economic interests within the society. Right. So if we narrowing it down to the political economy of media and communication sectors, we're essentially concerned about how these companies or media communication companies are so powerful in a short period of time, and how do they secure their market dominance, and how do they reach globally, right? So there are three key processes where we systematically studied it. So first, there's a horizontal integration. So this means that the platform firms or the platform owners spread to their adjacent market. So for example, Facebook has acquired Instagram and WhatsApp, right? So they're not exactly the same business, but they're all on the market of social media or personal intercommunication. Right? So how Facebook is quickly eating up this up and coming market competitors. And vertical integration means that how one company spread their power across the value chain. Right? So one of the ancient example is how New York Times, which is the news agency, also owns a paper mill and also owns some forests in Montreal in Canada, right? So they are owning the whole supply chain from the manufacturing of pulp, of paper, to owning their own distribution chain, right? So from the production, distribution, and consumption, they exert their power vertically through the value chain. And similarly, in the platform sense, Twitter also owns various API aggregation company, or the social advertising companies. Right? So these are kind of the upstream and downstream way of this company to expand their power. And lastly, the process of transnationalization, as we see that all these platforms are successful in a sense that they're also global, right? They're reaching different pockets of geography and different pockets of population. So how do they do this is also one of the questions that concerns the political economists. So those are the three kind of intellectual roots or goes into platform studies. And now we're moving to look at platforms as a research objects. So what exactly about platform that we're studying as informed by those existing and still emerging academic disciplines. So basically to study platform is to disassembling platforms. So to take it apart and to put it back together into their social and economic context. So there are crucially two dimensions in the way that we conceive platforms. And you can find this work in Josef van Dijk's 2013 book called Connectivity. I forgot the exact name, but there she provide taxonomy of different elements that makes the platforms. So first dimension is the techno-material dimension, and second is the socio-economic, and we'll go through each in the following slides. So firstly, if we look at platform in their techno-materials, there are 5 targets that we're looking at. So first is the data and metadata. Right. So on the right-hand side, I included a screenshot of one of the the popular YouTube video that was pushed to me yesterday when I was logging on to the website. And here you can see that every time we use this platform, there is a huge amount of data that is being generated, not only by the users, but also by the person who uploads these videos. And this includes the length of the videos, the likes, the dislikes, the views and date, and all of these are the crucial data and metadata, right? And there are also scholars studying YouTube videos and especially the links in their information box, right? So you can use different methods to put together these links and to look at how in the video ecosystem this links to a center point, right? So usually the more powerful or popular YouTubers or YouTube account receive more links, and also you can see that all of the video are embedded with some merchandise. Now, there's a way to study all of this data and to understand how these networks are interconnected. So data and metadata is one of the elements of the techno-material components of platforms. And secondly, of course, there is algorithms. Right? Think about the Amazon recommendations when you buy, purchase, or browsing items. Right? So how do they know what to recommend to you as a buyer, and use your previous purchasing history? And probably one of the most famous or well-known example is Netflix recommendation system. And so Netflix actually held kind of a computer science or mathematic competitions for the scientists to come up with the most accurate and error-free algorithm to recommend people the videos they like, right? And it's really kind of having a cash prize and let the other scientists to do the work for them, right? And Netflix is also kind of important in the algorithm study in this way. An algorithm, of course, is hard to study because sometimes we conceive as a black box, right? But there are emerging field of algorithm studies also come up with different ways to understand algorithm, not exactly from the perspective of these platform owners, but also from how individuals come to conceive, understand, engage, and context this algorithm. Right? So people can sometimes, through the videos that recommend to them, to deliberately mess up with or play with the system. Right? So the emerging field of algorithm studies are also blooming in this perspectives. And next, we have protocols. So protocols means that this design that are going into these platforms that come to predefine the actions or the affordances by the platform owners. Right. So this example is when I click on the share buttons on a particular Facebook post, and you can see that these actions are already predefined by Facebook. Right, and the functions or the gateway that they provided not only matters to Facebook because it helped them to populate their own business ecosystems or a flow of data, but we as users we were only given the option to do these certain things. So as an average user, if you're a coder or more advanced, of course you can think about other different ways to use it. But for the majority of people, the way that this platform defined what actions is enabled and are designed and built in their protocol also matters to how we use this. And next we have interface, of course, to study platforms. And here is an example of a mobile platform, right? So this is a design element of a TikTok, and you can see that the way that the platform is presented in the interface also shape our understanding or uses or perceptions or the cultural productions on top of these platforms. And so if you open TikTok, this video just capture the whole of the screen, right? There is very hard to find close or exit buttons. And you can just, the actions that you are prescribed to is scroll up and down, right? Rather than left and right, you scroll up to browse new videos and you can also scroll down. Right? So how this interface is designed also influence, for example, how video is shot and presented on these platforms. And lastly, there is the default settings, right? So these are the settings that every average users, unless deliberately go into their own personal setting and change it, this is how it's the assumptions or the basic the way that the platform wants you to make use of the system, right? So whether your post is available to the public or only to friends, or to what degree other advertisers can access and see your data. So these are also important. And in the gender aspect, previously Facebook does only have 2 gender definitions in their registration, right? So these are all important, not only technical but also social economic kind of decisions that made by individuals into this technical system. So moving on to the socioeconomic elements, we have the ownership status, governance of platforms, and business models. So the ownership status basically asks who owns what in these platforms, right? So these data are publicly available for publicly listed company, which means the companies are listed on the stock market. Okay, and for some private companies, which means that they're not issuing shares and they're not providing data to the public. There's a way to find out this information, but the ability to do so is limited. So unless this company has provided some documents, it's basically a hidden kind of a structure, right? But luckily, for those of the big platforms, they're almost all publicly listed. Okay, so this is also a good way for you to access their public records. So if for the US listed platform companies such as Facebook, Twitter, or Amazon, you can access the Edgar database, which is a database held by the Securities and Exchange Committees. So once this company goes public, they're abiding by law to disclose their company information or their revenue figures, their ownership status, and to make it public. Okay. You can search up this database if you wanted to look at the political economy or the ownership status of this of particular companies. And the document that provide you the ownership structure of this company is called their proxy statement. Also, in the document filing system is called the definitive 14A form. So here you will find exactly who owns how much percent of this company. Okay, and also another good source is their annual report. So for companies that are not listed on the US stock market, so for example, some of the Chinese-based digital platforms who are listed on Hong Kong Stock Exchange, or some of the European ones, usually you can find their ownership status in their annual report. And they will tell you, how much shares, equity share, which means that how much, percentage of business they own, or how much voting power they own, right? So one common characteristic of this digital platform is that their owners of the very key figures owns 19% or significant of the majority of the voting power, right? So which means as an investor, if you purchase any stocks, you only own the monetary, the equity stocks, but you don't have the say, the equal amount of say as the CEOs or the key deciders. Okay. So here, I apologize for the very small figures, but I just wanted to include what the annual report looks like, right? And often one of the concerns or conceptions we have about this platform is they're highly obscure, it's very hard to get data. But from my experience, because I primarily engage with platform in this, in this way. So actually, annual report can provide you a lot of information, right? Because they're by law to disclose their information. So you can find, their company history, their ownership status, their revenue figures, their risk, right? So because they also need to let the investor know what are some of the emerging, legal suits that are going on to these companies, or what are some of the business competitors that are up and coming could threaten their business models, right? And of course, we take this all this information in a critical way, right? So after all, it's still a document come up with privately owned company to appeal to the investors, right? So you can also do content analysis based on this for the way that they present or talk about some of these issues. And you can also, collect all their historical annual report and to do a tracking and tracing or study their historical evolution. And so that is all to say that the annual report, if you haven't had the chance to go through it, it's usually a huge and very text-heavy document, but you can find one or thing or two that is different than from the popular news or any other journal articles. It's a good source, and it's all publicly available. Okay, so here is an example of my own study or my own research. So basically, I look at institutional investors, which means that these are not individuals, but rather investment banks or pension funds or so the investment funds. So their ownership in the Chinese-based platform versus the US ones. Okay, and you can see there's highly convergence between the two, which means that most of the money that either the pension funds goes into that are managed by these institutions, or the various financial products that we bought from the banks. are probably owned by this, and a small portion of them are invested in both the Chinese and US platforms. And this shows you a very different picture from understanding this platform just as in their own cultural context, right? So there is not much differences because the capital market sees both of these companies are very profitable and highly likely to generate profit or return on investment. Okay, so this shows you a different makeup of this emerging two camps of digital platforms. And we're moving along from the ownership status, ownership structures, to the governance of platforms. So if we talk about platform governance, there is two aspects. So the governance of platforms, so which means that how platforms govern within a certain jurisdictions through policies, directives, or particular regulations. And this should be fairly easy to research as a policy research or content analysis or document analysis. Right? So you can find different documents published by various level of governance to the digital platforms, and especially to regulate their economic activities or market competitions. And governance by platforms, which means that how platforms govern their interrelations between users and various institutions, and also the complementor, which means that the third parties that build on the platforms. Right? So they're both implicit and explicit rules. So of course, the implicit goes into the design, the techno dimensions, right? So the design, the interface, the default acts as a implicit governance, right? So what makes platform governance so interesting is that it's not all in the legal sense, right? Some of them is contract-based, some of them is paralegal, and there's really no law to enforce it. And some of them are embedded in the techno sense. And there are also explicit rules to manage how users should behave on their platforms and how third party can use their platform for, right? And these are, of course, I think you are all aware, that are issued in the end user license agreement, privacy policies, term and service, and also developer guide, right? So if you study Apple and you look at the developer guide they issued for the app developers, right? So it's quite extensive, right? So it tells you what font, what design style should you adopt, right? So this is all where the platform acted power to standardize the production of apps to maximize or to have a good user experience for the app user or the iPhone users. Okay, so these are all the documents that we can look to, and of course there are different ways to engage with this document. You can do comparison, you can do content analysis, or you can do critical discourse analysis. Right? So it's really about finding the research object and apply the appropriate research method. And lastly, the socioeconomic elements is the business models, right? So business model, which basically means how do they make money, right? And what are the most important economic activities that this platform engage with? And similarly, you can find this in their annual report through their database called Edgar, and this is for the US listed platform companies. And if for the other publicly listed companies that are not necessarily on the US, you can always go to their company website, and there is a section called Investor Relations. Okay, so the different platform changes, but this wording is exactly the same for different platforms. And here I provide an example of Alibaba, which is the biggest e-commerce companies rivaling Amazon right now. So here you can see, if you click on Investor Relations, it shows you, all their general meeting records, their SEC filing, which means that document they submitted to the US stock regulators. And because they're also dual listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, it also made available their annual reports there. The structure of governance, corporate governance. So who sits on the board, right? So the board of directors is also an important site to look at of who has this power, who decide where the company should go in their future business direction, right? So they constitute two levels of controls. One is the level of control the company's operation on a day-to-day basis, but for the board of director is more of the the macro resource allocation. Right? So should they put more resources into developing AI, or they should invest in cloud computing? So this is also help you to understand where these businesses are going. Okay, so in their annual report, they will tell you how much money they made from each category of services and how much they make from different geographies. So how much they made within China, the Chinese market, or internationally. Okay, so annual report is a great source. Okay, so here is also an example that from my own study that as I look at how these companies, Tencent, which is also a gaming and social media or personal communication companies in China, versus Alibaba, right? And you can see here the income from investment, which means that the stock they own, right? Or the company that they purchase, or the money they made by selling off their own subsidiaries, how much they made from this type of activity within their whole revenue generation. And this tells you the Chinese-based digital platform has a very different business model compared to US ones. And so the US ones are mainly based on advertising. So they buy and share and sell advertising as their primary income. But for the Chinese ones, they are generating profit from their investment, from selling off their properties, or from investing in up and coming smaller companies. And once those smaller invested company goes public, they will rip off the reward as well. Right? So this is pinpoint to the financialization aspect of platforms, which means they're actually in operating as a venture capital fund, right? So they are buying out smaller companies for one, to stifle competitions, and also to as a means to generate profit, because making investment and generate profit is always easier and more profitable when the market's good compared to developing their own product, which can take longer. And then you can find similar writings and similar trends within some of the US platforms, such as Apple, Google, and Facebook, right? So they're all also very active in purchasing smaller companies as well. Okay, so lastly, hopefully you're not bored yet. I'm going to show you some of the existing platform study research and show you some examples that what you can take away with platform studies. So there are several lines of emerging research on digital platforms. These include platform evolution history. So if there is a platform that you're particularly interested in, or the platform has already dead and gone, you wanted to look at how it evolved. Platform studies method is, of course, very helpful in this sense, right? So you can see how their technical architecture changes over time, and how this influences their business and operations. And secondly, there is emerging studies on digital platforms and cultural productions. Right? And I'm sure that even some of us are platform culture producers, right? So if we have our own YouTube account or Instagram account, we product content based on what the platform is trending, for example, how people engage with that. And so digital platform and cultural action is also an emerging line of research. And next, we have also study of platform labors, right? And this is highly context specific and requires a lot of field work if you trying to either work in as a platform workers, or you observe as a participant and interview some of the platform workers. And there is also studies around platform governance. So how, for example, certain actions or activities or relationships or business relationships are governed by these platforms. Okay, and I'll show you examples from each of this line, and of course, I think you might have encountered many of them in your own studies. So platform history and evolution, there is a book that written on Twitter. So these two scholars are looking at how Twitter have changed some of these key affordances and technical designs. So where does the ad function come from Twitter, and how does people use the hashtag, right? So these are all not natural decisions. They don't just come as the way it is, but it's it's a design decision that made by someone originally and later has been reused and reappropriated for another function through the individual uses. Okay, and there are also a study looking at dead platforms, right? The platforms are not already successful. What are the reasons that led to their demise? Okay. So here is one of my own research. So I traced the development of Twitter, which is kind of a Chinese counterpart to Twitter with more functionality. It's called Weibo. We look at how this platform changed from a relatively open and publicly interested entity, but still not to say that it's still a privately owned company after all, to a more kind of intensely datafied and commodified and monetized platforms. And we did this by looking at the corporate documents. So those documents that I mentioned previously, such as annual report, their filings with the stock market, their revenue figures, their business strategies, and the published news report of the CEOs and key operating figures of Weibo. And we took that and also government regulations through policy research, and also some of the digital methods. So we look at the APIs, we look at how the interface have changed, how Twitter has changed its way to address, or to not change its way to address its users. Right, so we collect all the sources and come up with a history kind of categorization of the different stage Weibo has gone through in its historical evolution over a span of 10 years. Okay, so these are where you can derive some of the sources that we just talked about to study a single platform. Okay, and next we have the platform and cultural protection theme. So this is a book cover of a manuscript that just came out last month or several months ago. It's a really good book. It's very comprehensive. It's written by Thomas Poole, David Nyberg, and Brooke Erin Duffy. So they touch upon various aspects and various type of platform culture. So ranging from the video and video sharing platforms to news and games, right? And we all know that platform and news productions is one of the highly topical issues and issues that attract a lot of regulators' attentions. And so how these news agencies are adopting the platform's metric or the platform definition of successful, for example, high numbers of tweet, retweet, or likes, how these metrics are funneled into their production of content, right? So how the content becomes contingent on the platform metrics and its dynamics. Okay, and below there is a paper that's written by David and Thomas on the term contingent cultural commodity, right? So they parse out how platforms influence the cultural productions there. And next we have platform and labor. So even though that platform is touted by different organizations or platform owner as the clean or the the very light operations, but still it's very intense in terms of the infrastructure, the energy they consume, especially the labor aspect. Right. So here you can see that scholars looking at how platform has given rise to the racialized and kind of genderized labor. Right? So some of the platform labor are more dispersed and require 24/7 basically dedications, and you need to be patient, you need to be communicative, you need to stay in touch with your followers, your fans, to cultivate this interpersonal relationship that one day may become your business opportunity, right? And also another a strand of platform labor studies are looking at the delivery workers, right? So these are some of the examples that I read upon in my own studies, and I'm sure that there are a very vast amount of very brilliant work that coming from different contexts or geographic specific regions. Because the platform labor is still very tied to the labor structure and labor regulation of a certain market, right? So how platforms has come to change, challenge, and even reinforce some of the existing power relations and power labor arrangement in certain regions is very important. Okay, and lastly, there is platform governance. So those two aspects: how platform is governed by public institutions, and platform itself governing several interactions or data access. So on the left-hand side, there's a piece of work that's written by Richard Galver on what is platform governance, right? So there he kind of characterized the different elements of where to study platform governance. It's a really good piece of work, and can give you a lot of direction that you can delve into later on. And on the right-hand side is some of the work that I did to look at some of the digital platforms in China. So how does the two different versions of the same app made by this Chinese-based platform company? So for example, TikTok, which is the overseas version of Douyin, they're essentially the same thing, but they face different markets. So how this two versions of the same app regulate user activities and data and privacy differently. Okay, so there we look not only at policy research, which means that the existing data laws within the Chinese jurisdictions, but also how the platform has its own different privacy policies and term of service for these different versions of the same app, right? And what we found, as you would expect, that this international facing of platforms has more rigid or more complete data privacy protection or regulation in the European market, because here we have the GDPR and other data regulations. But also an important and often overlooked venue of how this platform is governed, it's through their app stores. Right? Because to make these apps available, all these app developer needs to publish their apps on different app stores. Right? So right now we have a predominant, Apple iOS versus Google Play stores. And these different app stores have their own power to set their privacy standards. So of course, the Apple iOS has more stringent procedures and app review guidelines for app applications. And for the Google iOS, it has more lenient protection frameworks. And of course, the upside is that Google iOS has more flexibility, which means if you are a app developers, it's probably better and easier to publish your apps on that. And but for Apple, it's highly standardized, and it basically affords better data protections for the Apple devices. So here it really tells us that beyond this company itself, it's also a tiered structure, right? So it's also, these companies also need to rely and kind of live on this different ecosystem that owned and controlled by Apple and Google respectively, and their platform governance also influence the smaller companies' platform governance as well. Okay, so I think that it's a lot to take in, and hopefully it is helpful to whatever way that you're thinking about platforms and to use it in your own research. So here is my email, so feel free to send me any questions, or even if you wanted to just chat of a certain ideas. So welcome to email me.